So we have a session that is called Religion, Civil Society, and Social Democracy. And we are very fortunate to have, for dealing with these key issues in the order of the program, Professor John Harris, who, as we know, is the founding dean of the School of International Studies at the Simon Fraser University in Vancouver, Canada, but often in UK as well. Rahul, I also, if I need to introduce you your own institution, I may do it for the few who have just landed this morning and I've never been to either before. And Rahul is the professor and chair of the Modern Politics of South Asia, South Asian Institute, Institute, I would say, such a prestigious place, and that is something we should say for those who are new to South Asian studies. This is really the place where in Europe, luminaries like Peter Wintermund, started modern. And Professor Irfan, who has come from Anadolu University in Istanbul, where he is part of the Department of Sociology. So, John, Irfan, Rahul, in this order, will present in
15 minutes, all right.
If you don't mind. And then we'll have more time for the discussion. John will present his paper on caste in the election and in the future of Indian democracy. And if Yogendra had been with us, it would have been an ideal discussion for that, but we'll do without him, I'm afraid.
Because my subject, my theme, follows very directly from one important theme in the discussion before the break. It's a theme which was addressed particularly by Yogendra, but also referred to by Christophe in his remarks in response. And this is the theme, the question of the significance of caste class politics in the present conjuncture. There's little room for doubt, I believe, that there's going to be a struggle over the conduct of a national caste census, probably quite early in the life of this government. The demands for such a census and the demands for further reservations that are surely likely to be associated with it are pretty certainly going to be resisted by Modi and the BJP. I think certainly they have historically strongly resisted suggestions that there should be such a national caste census. I think it's possible that this is the issue that's going to break the National Democratic Alliance. How will Mr. Nitish Kumar respond to the resistance to the demands for a national caste census, to the resistance of the BJP to those demands? At the same time, I think the struggle over the caste census may be the trigger for the mobilization of lower classes against crony capitalism that Yogendra looks for in the social politics of resistance. Quite a lot of what I was going to say was by way of just reminding us really of some of the history of caste politics. But I'll in the interest of time, probably cut quite a lot of that short. But I will just start by sort of reminding us of some of the context. Only 3 of the 90 secretaries of the government of India are OBCs, was a claim made by Rahul Gandhi in the course of this recent election campaign. A recent study concluded that 98% of the professors at the top 5 IITs are from the upper castes. Another showed that 90% of those in leadership positions in the Indian media are from such castes. Upper castes found to control 41% of the assets of the country. And upper castes constituted the largest single group among MPs in each of the 2009, 2014, and 2019 Lok Sabhas, and only, I think, in the present Lok Sabha has the representation of OBCs come to equal that of the upper castes. Now, figures like these should perhaps not all be taken at face value, but there can surely be no doubt about the enduring power in Indian politics and society of upper castes, who constitute at most, what, 15, perhaps 20% of the population. In thinking about the significance of caste and of caste censuses in the recent election and in the future of Indian democracy, we have to recognize the extent of what's been described as opportunity hoarding by upper castes and by dominant castes among the OBCs. In the age of the market, it's been shown caste is a resource, sometimes in the form of a network, its opportunity hoarding advantages discriminating against others. Evidence from studies of social mobility clearly shows that children of upper caste, urban, professional parents are far more likely than others to secure jobs in the upper levels of the labor market. Rightly so, it's sometimes argued, because they exhibit higher levels of merit. That argument, of course, fails to acknowledge that what is taken as demonstrating merit commonly reflects inherited advantage, for example, in access to education, as well as through socialization into a culture of aspiration. But caste discrimination is not only a matter of resources, very important though this is. Status differentiation, of course, matters to people in itself, because it has to do with their personal dignity and their recognition in society. This is so clearly reflected in that often derided politician Lalu Prasad Yadav's frequent statement to interlocutors such as myself: "What is this development you people talk about? I want respect for my people," he used to say. And he pursued, I think, a politics of dignity aimed at equalization of the status hierarchy and manifested in demands for descriptive representation. Now, I was going to just go back a little bit over the long history of the way in which the caste hierarchy was recognized in the framing of the Constitution, to remind us of Article 340, which provided for the appointment of a commission to investigate the condition of these backward classes and what has followed from it. I think I can cut all that and just go to saying that, of course, both the backward classes commissions called for the inclusion of caste in the census to improve information on the numbers and conditions of caste communities that should inform policy. There's a long history of such demands, generally resisted by the central government, always, I think, when the BJP has been in power, because it's feared the creation of divisions in what should be the organic unity of the Hindu nation. And more generally, never, I think, quite explicitly, because of the fear that a caste census would galvanize demands for more redistribution at the expense of the upper castes. I mean, the second UPA government, in the face of what at the time was cross-party support for the inclusion of caste in the 2011 census, finally prevaricated so that in the end, a separate socioeconomic and caste census was conducted in that year, in 2011. Its findings on caste populations have still not been made public on the grounds that they're full of errors. And it was in this context that in 2022, the government of Bihar, headed by Nitish Kumar, determined on the conduct of a caste census in the state, and it was the publication of its findings in October 2023 that really reignited Mandal politics. Reported that 63% of the population of Bihar was constituted by OBCs, including 36% of the most marginalized, extremely backward castes. Together with the scheduled castes and tribes, therefore, the backward communities made up around 85% of the population of Bihar. The Congress Party almost immediately said that in office it would conduct a national caste census with a commitment to abolishing what is supposed to be the 50% cap upon quotas established by a court in 1992, and then to raise reservations in line with population numbers. Mandal politics were back in the fall of last year. Then, when the claim made by Narendra Modi and other BJP leaders in the national elections that have just passed, the claim that the NDA would secure its 400 seats came to be associated, as it was, with the idea that the new government would rewrite the constitution, which might well include the abolition of reservations. For the first time in an election, Modi lost control of the narrative. He evidently felt compelled to devote attention to denying the intention of rewriting the constitution or of eliminating reservations. And it was in that context that he came up with that extraordinary claim for which there was no evidence at all, that the Congress was determined to take reservations away from Hindus and give them to Muslims. Quite how important all this was in the crucial BJP losses in UP, Maharashtra, Rajasthan, and Haryana is hard to tell, when divisions within the state units of the BJP and errors of judgment in candidate selection evidently played an important part in the outcomes in all these states. And it may be that the case that the OBCs are the key to the 2024 election, which was put by a writer for The Caravan, was overstating the case. But I think he was quite right in drawing attention to their significance in those crucial, particularly in UP. Anyway, evidence from the election really showed the continuing importance of caste in electoral politics. The findings of recent studies of the increased importance of voter choice, both of ideology and of administrative competence, notwithstanding. Anyway, cutting then to the crucial points that I want to make. I think it is probably relevant that I should refer to the Rohini Commission that was set up by the BJP government in 2017 to advise on subcategorization of OBCs. Its report of more than 1,000 pages was submitted, I understand, in August 2023, but those findings have not yet been made public. It's reported, though, that the Commission found that 1% of OBC caste groups had taken more than 50% of reservation benefits. In sum, I mean, it seems most unlikely to me that the demand for a caste census, linked with the idea that quotas should be determined in line with numbers, will go away. And the question is that is the part that it will play in the future of Indian democracy. What are its implications? One view, of course, is that it's a matter for great regret that the idea of social justice should have been reduced to meaning only reservations for communities deemed backward. It's argued reasonably that reservations are snake oil, to use the expression of Pratap Mehta, for the resolution of the problems that people confront in securing and improving their well-being. Won't these objectives be secured rather when people have access as citizens and not as members of marked communities to education of good quality and to affordable quality healthcare? These are among the conditions too, surely, for the realization of an economy that generates much more and higher quality productive employment. As it is, public sector employment has been declining in any case, and the numbers of jobs that reservations can deliver will benefit only a small proportion of those from the communities that are marked for access to them. According to this reasoning, the whole business of affirmative action, especially when it's a substantial majority of the population that is supposed to be entitled to it, is really a kind of a sideshow in relation to the considerable problems of livelihood and well-being, and leads actually to a dead end. Now, the reasoning behind that, I think, fairly commonly expressed case, the reasoning behind that case, it seems to me, is very strong. But I also think it fails adequately to recognize the problems of social inequality, of caste discrimination or opportunity hoarding with which I began these remarks. Lalu Prasad was decried as a buffoon whose governance of his state was disastrous. But the politics of dignity that he espoused was not at all unreasonable, I think, in the context. There remains, and not just in Bihar, a serious problem in caste discrimination and the reproduction of the status hierarchy. The question is whether affirmative action, as it has come to be practiced, offers a way forward for the resolution of the problem. There are actually some positive findings in the results of recent research, suggesting, for example, that the appointment of more lower caste officials can help to make the state more accessible to the wider population and to help citizens to make claims on the state. A quantitative study based on data covering 5 decades has shown that strong OBC political representation in combination with higher OBC representation in the bureaucracy makes for higher public spending in the social sectors. At the same time, some solid research counters the claim that reservations reduce the quality of the bureaucracy. disadvantaged group members recruited via affirmative action into the IAS were found to have performed comparably with others in a study of the management of the National Rural Employment Guarantee across the 4 states of Andhra, Karnataka, Rajasthan, and UP. And the question remains, of course, as to whether positive outcomes from reservations aren't outweighed by negatives, including competition between lower caste groups that has the effect of reinforcing caste ideology and identity and causing the political fragmentation of poorer people in Indian society. And that's really the challenge, I think, that the arguments like those that were put very, very powerfully by Yogendra. And I think, rather in line with some of your own arguments, Christophe. I mean, I think that's the problem that we have to address in pursuing that argument that maybe the issue of the caste census is the trigger for the kind of lower caste class mobilization that I think we are looking for. Whether it won't actually encourage fragmentation rather than people coming together in the lower caste class mobilization. That's my 2 words there.
Thank you very much, John. And if there were any further review, I that might be
Okay, thank you. Without wasting time in thanking, which I will do over dinner, let me get to the matter straight away. So just to remind you, the title of my presentation is On Democracy to Come, a counter thesis on Hindu-Muslim relations. Before I begin, I just want to make a few qualifications. The first one is that a new thinking cannot emerge with continued dependence on existing vocabulary. A new thinking requires a new language. Now, of course, I assume that there is a need for new thinking. Those of you who may not share this, of course, you will have difference there. So this is the first premise. The second one is, and it is connected to the first one, what Acharya Budyo said about doxa. Doxa is a set of vocabulary through which we think, but about which we do not think. Okay? Doxa is a set of vocabulary or terms through which we think, but about which we do not think. And if that is the case, we cannot have a new dawn of thinking. My third point is, this will be a critical presentation, and it may have criticism of some people who are in this hall. But this criticism is aimed to generate productive ideas. If I were to use a Marxist vocabulary, it is not an antagonistic criticism; it is a friendly criticism, aimed to generate more ideas. So, with these 3 qualifications, let me begin my presentation. So I was invited to speak about Indian Islam and the future of democracy in this conference. The original title of which was Future of Indian Democracy and Hindu Supremacy. With the Hindu supremacy deleted, the current title is only the Future of Indian Democracy. Either way, the title assumes A, India is a democracy, but in some kind of crisis, especially with BJP's rise in 2014, and B, therefore, the need to save democracy, and we already have the terms like restoration, recovery, and so on. So the need to save democracy from populism and authoritarianism, and in rare cases, the word used is totalitarianism and sometimes fascism. This assumption is not specific to the conference, rather it is widespread and general. Moreover, this premise, intellectually speaking, is born out of a system of knowledge, which I have elsewhere described as Hindu-Orientalism. Hopefully, by the time I finish my talk, it will be clear that democracy is actually a byword for Hindu domination and a perversion of genuine democracy as I understand it. Hence, the question for me is not about protecting democracy, but thinking about and preparing the ground for, as Derrida would say, for democracy to come. Those who share the assumption, whether in India or abroad, of supposedly two visions of democracy for India, represented by BJP RSS on the one hand and the Congress party on the other, maintain that the antidote to BJP RSS is Congress. That is, while BJP RSS is apparently exclusive, Congress is inclusive. It is precisely this assumption based on which some have described the result of 2024 Indian election as a victory of the Congress party, even though Narendra Modi was elected as Prime Minister for third term. So at the outset, I want to say that the option between the so-called good Congress and bad BJP is basically false. Far from being opponents, historically speaking, Congress and BJP are indeed almost friends. Let me demonstrate my thesis about the ground shared between the two parties in relation to the recent election campaign. There is no denying the fact that Islamophobia was at the heart of Modi's electoral campaign. He held Muslims responsible for almost every problem India faced, including for the backwardness of Dalits and OBCs, and describing Muslims as robbers of country's wealth and resources. Of course, Modi described Muslims as infiltrators and those who produce more babies. Later, he drew, as he already did in 2001, an equation between Islam and terrorism. In an election rally, Modi attacked the opposition alliance led by Congress for its manifesto bearing the imprint of the Muslim League. In linking Congress and the Muslim League, Modi's actual target was not Congress, but Muslims. The ultimate enemy are Muslim, Congress simply bearing the imprint of the Muslim League. The Congress counter-attacked Modi, accusing him and his political ancestors of being in love with Muslims. Later, the Congress spokesperson, Superior, went on to say how Modi went to Pakistan uninvited and why over a decade ago when he visited Jinnah Shrine. To prove that Congress party, not BJP, is the real enemy of Pakistan, she stressed how it was Indira Gandhi who broke Pakistan into two, leading thereby to the creation of Bangladesh. This is Congress spokesperson. So as my description shows, the apparent fight between the Congress and BJP, in my analysis, is no more than shadow boxing. It is amply clear that in this attack and counter-attack, the figure of Muslims as the ultimate enemy is kept alive by both Congress and BJP. Let me note here that in the Hindu imagination, Pakistan is not just a country. It is a shorthand for Islam and Muslim, and also a justifiable way for attacking both. The common ground between Congress and BJP stems from a shared vision of India as a territorial Hindu nation and democracy as a tool to actualize it. Long before there was any BJP, during the interwar period, Hindu intellectuals debated democracy as a political system, and they readily accepted it. And this is from a book which from an article which Christophe wrote. And this is a quote. The Hindu intellectuals during the interwar period readily accepted democracy, both because democracy is a convenient way to establish the domination of the majority community. Unquote. Both Gandhi and Nehru differently upheld this notion of democracy. According to Nirmal Kumar Bose, who was an anthropologist and who worked as Bengali interpreter of Gandhi. This is Nirmal Kumar Bose writing. Quote, Gandhi tacitly formed an alliance with those who believed in a restoration of Hindu domination. end of quote. The idea of India as essentially a Hindu nation is not just Gandhi's, it is also Nehru's. In the Constituent Assembly, when Vallabhbhai Patel introduced a motion to scrap political representation of minorities, and elated Nehru congratulated Patel for bringing this historic motion to discard the evil of religious minority representation. And Nehru said, and I quote, "Now, of course, if it is a democracy, in the long run or in the short run, it is the will of the majority that will prevail. It is in the very nature of things in a democracy that the will of majority will ultimately prevail." This is within a span of 50 seconds, end of quote. Nehru. Now you could say that, well, Nehru used this word majority not in communitarian sense, but it is, as liberals would have it, at a procedural term, issue-based. But that is not the case because the context in which he used it was very clear because the subject of the discussion is religious representation of minorities. Now, if this is the case, my point then is that across the divide of RSS, BJP, Congress, Samajwadi Party, AAP, BSP, or CPI, and going beyond the apparent difference among Savarkar, Nehru, and Gandhi, there is a shared ground of India as essentially a Hindu nation and democracy as a respectable, effective way to run and manage that nation. So here is my first argument. Hindus' enthusiasm for democracy has mostly been not due to its potentiality for justice, freedom, and dignified equality, but the actuality of it simply as a means to install a majoritarian rule over others, especially Muslims, who were fashioned as a threatening others by British colonialism and Orientalism, an imagery that Savarna Hindu elites readily adopted. Of course, this is not the original meaning of democracy. It is a Hindu notion of democracy. The original meaning of demokratia in Greek is capacity to do things, not majority rule. In contrast to monarchia, which is monos means one, oligarchia, hui oligo, which means the few. So in contrast to monarchia and oligarchia, democracy has no reference to number. It simply connotes a collective body of people. And since nowhere on this planet is a people monolithic, the capacity to do things would be diverse and multicultural, as would be the cultural goals and political idioms. The equation between democracy and majority rule was therefore met negatively, not by the proponents of democracy in Greece, but by the critics of democracy. And it is precisely this equation between democracy and the rule by majority, where majority is taken as a distinct ethno, that has caused violence across the world. So the statement by American President Roosevelt says, quote, "Extermination of Indians was ultimately as beneficial as it was inevitable." This is Roosevelt. This bears testimony to a violent notion of democracy. When democracy is designed in such terms as it is in India, deployment of bulldozers and lynching are not surprising. To finish my first argument, consider, and I want you to pay special attention to this, consider why there is nothing called pseudo-democracy as a term in the Indian vocabulary, but you do have something called pseudo-secularism, which is a Hindu neologism used most violently by El Gadwani, who began Dharma through his Rath Yatra and destroyed the Bani Masjid. My point is, it is this wider political framework developed in colonial India which gave birth to what is called the Muslim question, and about which nearly every prominent politician from Gandhi, Nehru, Savarkar, Rajendra Prasad to Ambedkar, everybody has to say something about this Muslim question. Scholars have drawn a parallel between the Jewish question in Europe and the Muslim question in South Asia, or what was known as the Indian subcontinent. And this is my second argument. The phrase the Muslim question is misleading, if not bogus, because what is called the Muslim question is in reality the Hindu question. In 1947, Christophe,
Which one?
Yeah, that is a very good one. I would have to check my reference. But I just wanted to ask you, do you know Jaffrelot Shastri? See, you steal our figures. This is Jean-Paul Sartre. In India, we call Jaffrelot Shastri. In 1947, Jean-Paul Sartre, he spoke on the Jewish question. Okay. This is a lecture which is titled Reflection on the Jewish Question. What is interesting, Sartre explicitly spoke as a Christian. Let me say, Jaffrelot Shastri. What he said, that anti-Semitism was not a Jewish problem, but a Christian problem. Okay? Now, and this is his quote, there is no Jewish problem, there is an Aryan problem. To give another comparative example, rather than answer the question, who is a nigger, American writer James Baldwin, he remarked, and I quote, what white people have to do is to try and find out in their own hearts why it was necessary to have a nigger in the first place. Because I'm not a nigger, I'm a man. If I am not the nigger here, and if you invented him, you white people invented him, then you have to find out why you did it, unquote. If we approach the Muslim question, the way James Baldwin viewed the Negro question, the so-called Muslim question in the ultimate analysis is a Hindu question. So Hindus have to find out in their own hearts and mind why it was necessary to invent the Muslim question, and with it, the Islamophobia, which is rampant worldwide, and in many ways, India is actually the leader of Islamophobia. Since I'm talking about the Muslim question and the Jewish question, in passing, it is relevant to note what Gandhi said about Zionism. And this is a quote. Gandhi, if the Arabs have a claim in Palestine, the Jews have a prior claim in Palestine. This is Gandhi. Prior claim. This is just a tiny word, but since he was a lawyer, this tiny word can have monumental consequence, which it had. Now you can judge how peaceful or non-violent this statement of Gandhi is. Returning to what I see as a Hindu question, there are many forms in which Muslims appear in this Hindu question. One form is sheer absence or silence. So consider an explanation, and this is by Rahul. So he recently wrote an essay after the election result, in which he juxtaposes the vision of Vivekananda and Modi. In this vision, and Rahul's argument is that the vision of Vivekananda has won and Modi's vision has been defeated. There is no Muslim here. The assumption is that Muslims have to choose between Modi and Vivekananda. In this analysis, while Modi is depicted as exclusive, Vivekananda is portrayed as one and quote, with conviction of accepting all religions. Right? This reading of Vivekananda, to the extent that I know, is not entirely correct. In fact, Vivekananda doesn't accept the originality and truth of other religions. In his 1898 letter addressed to a Muslim, he wrote, and I quote, the truth is, Advaita is the last word of religion and thought, and the only position from which one can look upon all religion and sect with love. I believe it is the religion of the future enlightened humanity. This is Vivekananda in 1898. Further on, as we know, he takes Hindus as an older race than either the Hebrew or the Arab. And based on that assumption, he famously called for a synthesis which is between Vedanta brain and Islam body. But this supposed synthesis is not only hierarchical. Brain and skeleton. They do not have the same value. But what it also does, that Vivekananda definitionally monopolizes Hinduism as the only truth discovered well before Moses, Christ, and Muhammad or other state. In my view, the discourse of Vivekananda is incomprehensible without Hindu Orientalism and Western theosophical movement of which it was in many ways derivative. So my final and third argument is this. The discourse of people, and I have critiqued Ahmed in my second book, which is called Religion as Critique. So the discourse of people from Ahmed Sen to Ram Guha to the award-winning radicals like Arundhati Roy. In their discourses, Muslims appear at most as mere statistical entity as opposed to thinking beings who have a culture or tradition of their own. A discourse premised on Muslims as an objectified statistical entity rather than Muslims as autonomous thinking beings is nowhere close to any idea of what a genuine democracy is. So since both the actors and analysts of Indian democracy do not take, it is not to say that I'm opposed to empirical study. No, I'm not opposed to empirical study, but I don't have much sympathy for pure empiricism. So since both actors and analysts of Indian democracy do not take Muslims as thinking beings and treat them as sheer object of statistics, the existing language of democracy is filled with violence. Planned anti-Muslim violence is called riot. So yesterday, after the criticism of this term also, Lalit said that he's planning to have a film on Delhi riot. And we had that debate. Okay? Now, to prevent the other 2020 Delhi pogrom was not right. He called it auto trigger. So this is a very mystical explanation. Auto trigger. Now, even in the recent interview which Christophe gave to
That will be your conclusion.
it is. And this will be just the final sentence, but I don't know how long that sentence will be. So, Christophe, who knows, he keeps talking about Hindi theft, right? Of course, you know that there is Urdu language. I mean, this is the language I've been raised. I think you know it, and still you keep talking about Hindi theft, right? So my question is, before a community is meant to be prepared for genocidal violence, it is the language which is stigmatized. The scholars of genocide have written about it. So the lynching of Muslim is preceded by the demonization of language. So, and this has happened to Urdu beyond the divide of Congress and India. Okay? So I want you to ask yourself, this is the long final sentence. How do most members of the Hindu public react when they see someone read Bangla or Tamil newspaper as opposed to read Urdu magazines in a daily metro? Is the reaction same? When our reaction and emotions become the same towards Muslim as thinking beings rather than Muslims as objectified statistical entity, we will have laid the foundation for democracy to come. To save the existing democracy amounts to prolonging what in Jacques Rancière's theorization is simply the unjust police order which rests on policy. To Rancière, policy is built on consensus and serves the existing violent hierarchy. The political in contrast is about dissensus, which imagines a possible world, the world to come. And a democracy to come then is an invitation about summoning the courage to imagine a possible world that rests on the civility and beauty of argument rather than on the lethality of armament, which is foundational to the police order. This, it seems to me, is one of the only few ways in which we can escape the so-called existing democracy, the contemporary symbols of which are bulldozers, prison, fear, police raid, lynching, statistics, and yes, rampant bullshit, which is peddled by Prime Minister, amplified by media, sanctified by judiciary, and approved with silence by opposition leader such as Rahul Gandhi. To conclude, rather than saving the existing democracy, the three arguments I have made, I think, are vital to work and think about a democracy to come. Thank you.
So I am in the very similar dilemma as teacher this morning because we are supposed to break for lunch in film. We have a very short lunch and we will listen to you, Rahul. This is your turn.
We want to cancel.
No.
We've already invited me to give another. Which Harsh has actually also invited me to do. And I told Harsh that whether or not I believe in Vivekananda is not a debate to which I will go in right now, that I am a mortal, I am certainly not immortal. And therefore I will not take on all the things that mortals should not take on.
Present the paper you have prepared.
Okay, now
competitive authoritarianism.
Now the thing is that are you prepared to show my slides?
Yes.
Oh, you may need to operate them yourself? No.
Should I? Oh, you already have it. Oh, yes. This is what happens.
Let me get out of here.
You have some democracy in the department. No, I kind of, I have been posed almost, I don't consider, yesterday when I was talking with Irfan, he said that you look very composed when you don't get flustered. And I replied to him while I was driving him to the dinner place that I don't get flustered because I don't expect anything from anybody. And that is what, whether you call yourself Hindu or Muslim, you call it as. The other thing I want to mention is that I certainly will talk to you over maybe in Turkey about Vivekananda, but my piece was not at all located to attack or address even Muslims. I mean, Seema published it, and anybody would know that it was meant for Indian, the majority of women. So that criticism I can address in terms. But later on, what is Vivekananda, how we interpret him is a different situation. Now, the most serious challenge that could really frustrate me is the shortage of time. But when I was defending my doctoral thesis, my thesis advisor said that if you have anything meaningful to say, you can actually say it in 5 minutes. And therefore, I will not give you the 6th minute. So I told him that, look, I have worked for 6 years and you're going to give me 6 minutes. He said, Rahul, if you actually have added anything to what has been said, you will not take more than 6 minutes. But if you haven't done any work, you will not be able to do it in an hour. So following the inspiration of my doctoral supervisor, I will quickly proceed to act on his advice. So let me follow Seema's track and stand up.
Yes.
So what's happening here is that I want you to quickly look at what has happened to India in the last couple of years. And I'm sure that rankings are not perfect, but you will find that India has moved from 70 to 97 during this period. And during this period, Nepal has moved from 77 to 71. This is the first thing I want you to notice, that Nepal was not even a democracy. It took a long time to perform its constitution, and there it goes. Pakistan actually has improved. It's not declining. Bangladesh is in a serious condition. And of course, Turkey is also in a serious condition. And India actually looks worse than Poland and Hungary and Sri Lanka. And if you know a little bit about the policies of these countries, figure out what I'm trying to say. India is not in a good shape. And this bad shape is something that I have become sort of accused of calling competitive authoritarian, something that you're going to mention, which means that we are living in a situation where we have both competitive and democratic elements residing side by side with authoritarian propensities, which leads to a situation where the competitive and authoritarian propensities, which have been exacerbated over time, can lead you towards authoritarian. But if you look at the literature on comparative politics, you'll actually find that more countries actually transition from a competitive authoritarian to a relatively more democratic frame than do from a more authoritarian to a democratic frame. So this is actually a situation where there is both hope and despair, as we have been. The second thing I want to mention is that the manner in which civil society is framed in the literature suggests programmatic, citizen benefiting ideals related to social democracy. There's a whole literature in law and international law about this, and it actually looks at favoring opposition in politics. So if you look at the literature in comparative politics, you'll find that civil society and opposition politics are highlighted together. Now, in this milieu, I was trying to understand why competitive authoritarian regimes, within that context, do ethno-nationalists attack civil society. And in that context, I found that, and I'm writing a paper, that ethno-nationalism connects with populism in a way that most people get it wrong. Because ethno-nationalist leaders don't need populism in the same way as non-ethno-nationalist leaders, because they need it for votes, right? So populists basically do clientelistic things, give things in return for votes. And what ethno-nationalists do, and sometimes they may even do populism, actually they don't need that vehicle that much, because they actually try to make an enemy of a minority which is already vulnerable. And in so doing, you create a scare within the majority. So the whole causal mechanism of getting the votes is actually different from the hardcore populist strategy. The other thing I want to underline in my 5 minutes is that there's this whole debate between norms and political power, right? Some people believe that ideas alone will win, and some people think that politics matters. And my view is that both are very important, and this draws a lot from a teacher of mine at Columbia University, Jack Snyder, who has a book called Human Rights for Pragmatists, where he says that you can't just think of a regime without ideas and without norms, but you also cannot think of a regime without who actually holds those ideas and who actually holds those norms. And if you buy into that argument, you lead yourself into a situation where you understand that a strong leader with an ethno-nationalist appeal is going to create an elite that believes in this ethno-nationalism. And there is data to suggest from good academic articles that even in the case of India, the elite which belongs to the BJP actually has more programmatic civil society type of ideas than the elite that doesn't belong to the BJP. And there's systematic data on BJP representatives in parliament and with Hansa, which suggests this. So then once you get a political elite, the question is, why would an ethno-nationalist political elite want to attack civil society? I mean, after all, these buggers are not so important, right? It's not like putting the chief minister of a state behind bars. But what is counterintuitive and what is actually also not covered so much in the press and the media is that civil society is under siege. Because somehow these ethno-nationalist leaders understand that the last bastion for preserving democracy, and I think that was probably true in the current election as well, which even the political parties don't acknowledge to the extent that it should, is civil society. Now, what are the mechanisms through which this happens? Hussain and I have argued in a paper published in Pacific Affairs that there are three ways in this in which this happens, and I'm not going to belabor this point, but I would just like you to understand it conceptually and just look at this slide, that you can do three things. And you can do all these three things to both the state as well as the civil society. When political opposition is acute, you don't change the laws. You just interpret them. And I don't have the time to, I'm just believing that you have the acute sense to see what is in this slide. When it is somewhat more muted, but quite strong, you kind of just incrementally change that. And that's also in this slide. And finally, in those arenas where you don't find much political opposition, you just completely displace the damn thing. This is the one. So this is incremental stuff that you can do to civil society, that you can do to the state. This is Don't do anything, just deal with them differently, and you will progress towards competitive authoritarian regime, because more and more the incumbent will become more powerful and it will be far more difficult. So just to give you one example, I mean, when we say electoral bonds or the election commission, India had a free and fair election, right? But free and fair by what standards? By Putin's standards or by the standards of India? I would argue by Putin's standards it was fair, by Indian standards it was not. Now, very briefly, I will just talk about, and I'm saying this in the presence of some of the most erudite persons who can actually think on these subjects, and I will get them to read my paper and critically comment on it. But these are actually some of the mechanisms through which we have looked at how these things can happen. One of the mechanisms is actually that you make the Prevention of Money Laundering Act through a minor amendment with a small legal change much more lethal, so that you can get on to people like Dr. Harshman sitting here, so that you can get on to a whole lot of people that would have been very difficult without that legal change. And I don't want to get into the details of that. Second is that you take the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act, which has more to do with how can NGOs get foreign funding. And there's a whole story in the paper on how the law has evolved from 1976 to the 1980s, and then in 2010, where you already have a lot of the bad stuff. But the whole question is that in 2020 and in 2019, even before the law was amended, this government cancelled 4 times the number of NGO access to foreign funding than did the Congress government. So you use the same law, but you weaponize it differently, and then you change it. We don't have the time to discuss how you change it, what that does. Similarly, you make minor changes to the income tax law that actually make you have to, I mean, if you're a civil society organization, renew your status both as a charitable organization and as a status where donors can get the benefits on a 5-year basis. Then you change the law to a certain extent where these civil society organizations actually have to provide a whole lot more data about donors. And then not only do you take away those facilities, you actually also intimidate donors. Apart from the income tax law, there is income tax surveys. Now you don't have a mechanism to do anything. You just get into these guys' places, harass them, take their data, their digital data, their servers, don't let them get out of their offices, and use that data to feed the Central Bureau of Investigations. Use that data to feed into the Enforcement Directorate of the Ministry of Revenue, which is the PMLA rule. And then you use another instrument which is nowhere in the law, which even the big organizations whose names I would not take, but you would all know, they are so big, would not easily come to know, and they would not even nod anonymously to this, is that you have a very good bank guideline given by the Reserve Bank of India, which is called the prior reference category of foreign donors, who will be monitored very, very actively. And then they would be harassed to such an extent that the most powerful guys in the world will be smashed to smithereens. And of course, with that data, you intimidate domestic funding with the help of income tax law, and also with the help of the fact that the Foreign Contributions Regulation Act division and the Central Bureau of Investigations are both housed within the Ministry of Home. You can do a lot of fiddling around with this mechanism. So then what do we see? I have looked at, and here Dr. Harsh Mandar, although he doesn't want to be called an author, is a kind of a co-conspirator with me. I think this is I must acknowledge. And you can, so what we've done is we've looked at 15 organizations, and we've looked at 16 cases. Because we have Greenpeace as 2 cases. Greenpeace before 2018 is a very activist social movement type of organization, and after 2018 it goes docile, obviously because of the state, and continues to live. So you will see that Greenpeace moves from red to green. And the reason why it moves from red to green is that green does not mean that you have a great time. There are a lot of NGOs in India that are having a great time. There are a lot of NGOs in India that are not having a great time, but they don't have any problems. And some of them are doing good work. And then there are these green guys who have had one significant attack, which is good enough for you to feel the pinch. And then you have the amber guys who have had more than one attack in our coding. But these are guys who have been almost smashed to smithereens. Or in the case of the Center for Policy Research, if not smashed to smithereens, the president had to leave. And then you have the red guys, which includes one person in the audience today, who are people who have either gone to prison or, given the nature of the allegations, can be in prison. And if they are not in prison, it's a little bit of a puzzle. So in this entire set that we have analyzed, which we want to present as a scholarly paper, our findings suggest that in the red, almost all the organizations that are in the red are people who have defended minority rights, most significantly, and the rights of Muslims. In the amber category, you actually have a lot of organizations which are not very serious defenders of minority rights. Some of them look actually very docile, but for some reason they have been attacked. And I can, in Q&A, I can explain why. And there are all kinds of questions, and these are also hypothetical answers. But clearly, these organizations are not in the communal world. They're in the non-communal world. They are quite influential. And then there are certain organizations which do excellent work, which can still do their work with some. And then, of course, there are very good organizations that don't feel the attack to the same extent. So after looking at this entire data, and of course, we are living in the human world. We are not living in a world where we can think of law-like relationships. We came to the conclusion that clearly ethno-nationalism is making a huge impact on the intensity of attacks. Because almost all of these organizations, apart from Amnesty and Greenpeace in its earlier phase, are organizations that have been very, very staunchly in favor of defending the rights of minorities and especially the Muslims. In the case of Oxfam, you find an organization which has actually very significant class-based behavior which goes against crony capitalists. And in the case of Greenpeace, again, you have very strong environmental behavior which goes against crony capitalists. So it seems to me that ethno-nationalism and crony capitalism are actually coming together in a manner that tells us how this world is actually beginning to look much more difficult than an already imperfect world. Thank you very much.
So I suggest that we cut the break lunch by hours, and we use the 15 minutes it gives us for the Q&A, and I'm sure this kind of food will be substantial enough. Yeah, we'll take questions together if you don't mind. Take note. Yeah, 1, 2, 3 questions first.
Thanks, Christophe. I have 2 quick questions. One for
big question.
John. Starting with John, I think in the spirit of Irfan's presentation, I was wondering whether we should look at the obesity question by not relegating Muslims out of the story or as an object. So Muslims enter your account of the caste question and the OBC question as basically as these sort of marginal figures who are part of the story because the story is being communicated. But I think that is not what's going on for multiple reasons. One, they constitute the OBCs, and in multiple states like Bengal, for instance, they might be the majority. So they are sizable. Secondly, the nature of communalization which we are seeing is constituting the OBC category, politically speaking, from BJP's perspective. So I think there might be good reasons to revisit the narrative and plug back Muslims as quite central in terms of the narrative. At least that's the impression I got. I'll be curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah.
On Irfan, I'm really sympathetic to your argument. But what I was concerned about was whether the story you're telling is a bit too reductive. Because what I was struggling with and struck by is that in your account of Hindu Orientalism, Muslims were completely missing. So you seem to be giving a singular genealogy of Indian democracy, which is based on your reading of certain upper caste, broadly speaking, upper caste Hindu individuals. Where's Muslim agency in constituting Indian democracy? So what if I throw back what you call Hindu Orientalism back at you as a critique of your work?
Thank you. Please, and speaker, or maybe stand up.
Yeah. So, this is more fun. And it's about again your argument about this historical accounts of the religion of democracy in India. I mean, creation of this idea of notion of Hindu and Muslim and the separation of those. And talking about, okay, this is Hinduism and this is Islam and this is Hindu and Muslim. These are really historical. Putting different historical facts, figures, ideas. And you're talking about Muslim. Which Muslim you're talking about? A legal movement? The Bengali ulamas? Pantheonists? Al-Amrefan? Seculars? Who? Again, same thing. It's covered about Hindus. Putting Vivekananda, Gandhi, Savarkar in one basket is indeed a consequence. No, it's relevant. I mean, understanding and acknowledging the differences between them and look at the consequences. Just look at holidays in India. When you are talking about the secularism, just compare with the West. I mean, I think those important facts that we missed in your presentation, we have read, we have read, even those symbolic gestures, Muharram, even for the Shia community, is there. I think, and just compared to Germany, Germany is such a secular approach. I think this should be acknowledged in your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. We take 6 questions and then we'll see whether we can take more. Mujib?
My question is directed to Irfan. I am completely in support of your endeavor to interrogate the notion of democracy, 20%. But I'm not too sure whether this whole argument that BJP and Congress are the mere image of each other is indeed a very convincing one. While listening to you, I was thinking that I wish Narendra Modi should have been here in this sitting. The reason I'm saying is this, then why is it Narendra Modi raised this question or this whole attempt of Congress with Wahlen? If BJP and Congress are the same, what is it that Narendra Modi thought about Congress that is different, which is the reason why he wanted this? But I'm not suggesting that the argument that you presented, that there are more equally convincing evidences to support your argument. I can quote 2 politicians of Congress who believe almost in the.
Please don't. After 3 men, 3 women, and then we give some response, some political response. Anjali.
So, brilliant presentations, thank you. Just wanted to sort of draw attention to this very, very important nexus that we have in India today of the crony capitalists and, given especially the very deep and growing inequality in the country where 9 families own 50% of the wealth. And these are the very families or the capitalists, crony capitalists, who are also actively supporting, pushing the agenda and propping up the current regime, which we are seeing, we've heard so much about. So I think even when we're talking about the attack on civil society, Rahul, that you spoke about, it's very important to remember that what those who are raising any of these questions, because finally the media also is controlled by these families. If there is a very strong attack on any of the elements that are being critiqued, anyone who's either dissenting, critiquing any of these elements. So just wanted to.
Thank you. And the two ladies on the front.
Yeah. One question is to Rahul. You went through this very interesting thing of competitiveness, competitive authoritarianism in India's civil society. Do you think with the now coming elections, because we've been concentrating on that, this will come down a little bit? You know what I'm trying to say, the viciousness with which a lot of the people are targeted. Your red group, for example, like the Anhad and all, would they be slightly more diluted? Will it come down according to your own matrix that you presented, from whatever I have understood? The other one is to Irfan. I think he's brought a very important point of linking of terrorism. I'm not saying it's right or wrong. Important point of linking terrorism with Islamic terrorism only, while probably Hindu terrorism is of more recent origin. So I think maybe at another point you should have to explain a little more in order for people to understand the nexus or non-nexus.
Yeah, thank you. This is a question directed to all three, and actually.
But only one.
One question to
For
all
all
three of them, also to those who have been speaking. During the whole time of the elaborations today and yesterday, we were focusing a lot on the deficits and the problems. Nobody was analyzing, and why not, analyzing what are the things that BJP is giving to people in order them to elect. So what is so attractive for the electorate? And should we not think, if you think about restoring democracy, was it what they do obviously right?
Yeah, good point. There are four more questions. Shall we take them and then you will respond? Yes? So Jay?
No, I don't have a question really. I just have
Also, you keep it very,
very short. Just two reflections on your presentation, Irfan. First, 13th or 14th century India, Amir Khusro writing poetry, mingling his traditions of poetry with Indian Bhakti traditions, bringing in Krishna in his poetry. Qawwalis which are still sung today. Processes of othering existed then as they exist now. If you travel from Lahore to Calcutta in 1920 or even a little before, between 1920 and 40, a person reading a newspaper in Urdu would be as normal as a person reading a newspaper in any other Indian language. So the point I'm trying to make is the leaps of argument that we take in trying to fit things into categories have to be questioned.
Anna, you will
Yeah, thanks.
quickly.
I have a question to John Harris. I really like your presentation, and the percentages you showed about the people from particular communities holding positions, that it also shows the power relation. So I was just thinking, because we are talking about the future of Indian democracy, if that process happens where people from the most marginalized communities or those who are below in the caste hierarchy, if they come into those positions, do you think that will impact the electoral reforms? I'm talking about more on how does the participation of those who are still being marginalized will increase because of their positions in different positions of power happens. And the other thing which I wanted to ask Rahul was, because I work in Navsajan.
I know, and I was talking to Martin quite a bit. I didn't tell you that.
Yeah. So then you said green color, so I wanted to understand. Yeah.
Yes, Martin might want to turn red. Yes.
Very short question. Just about the kind of combining the previous talk and this one in the context of, where we're talking about elections, we're talking about the public face of government, we're talking about the public face of also maybe civil society. So could you, and about ideas. So could you say something about the internal story of how NGOs, formulate their positions, how they formulate their positions with regards to each other as the political context changes, and what public face does it have? I mean, does it have any impact on the politics, on voters' sentiment, etc.? And how does that affect expression? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I have a question to Rahul as well regarding you've highlighted and shown us the mechanism of repression of society. Given the election results and that we're discussing the future of the Indian democracy and the civic civil society now as part of this, what are some of the concrete steps that could be taken and who are the actors who produce that repression? Amit Shah is still in charge of the MHA and the government is still under the leadership of the BJP. So what would need to happen for the next 5 years to actually see change?
Thank you. Shall we go to the original order and ask John to respond first?
Okay, very quickly.
Yes.
I entirely take your point, Mohsin. I think it is extremely important to, I certainly didn't intend to, if you will, to leave the Muslims out of my narrative. If I have opportunity to develop this, I would want to very much take on board the point that you're making. Questions about, I think, the significance of increased representation of lower castes in the bureaucracy, and there is, of course, the possibility that those who are appointed, who get appointed to senior positions, join the other side, so to say. But I do think there is increasing sort of ethnographic evidence that the more there are lower castes in positions of some responsibility, some authority in the administration, that government is more accessible to people. So it's not a sort of perfect kind of a solution, but I think there is increasing evidence that it works in a positive way. Yeah.
Thank you. Irfan.
Okay, thank you for your extremely.
Oh, I should say something about why the BJP. Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you for your great questions, and they are diverse. I will try to respond to them. So of course, in theoretical terms, there is diversity everywhere. There is a question of class, there is a question of, so if you see, when we are talking about the two axes, we talked about class and caste. There is no religion. These are the two. So of course, there is an infinite variety of variables, but which variable is stressed and why, right? So I would ask you rhetorically, not you as a person, of course, why do we use the category called India? There is rural India, there is urban India, there is middle class, there is lower class. Niall Green wrote a book which is called Bombay Islam, in which he puts Islam in plural. And I wrote a critique of it. And I said that, look, why don't you put Bombay in plural? There is no one Bombay. There is a Bombay of Jhopalpatti, Garib logo ka Bombay hai, Amir logo ka Bombay hai. There are Tamil communities, there are Bihari communities, but you still speak of Bombay, right? So of course, I'm not oblivious to these factors, and then there's gender, there's Tamil, there's Telugu, Gujarati logo ka ek alag Bombay. So I think we need to ask this question, why is it that in certain cases, we collapse all these categories and in certain other cases, we bring it? Okay, so my question to you would be the following. When there is a question of Islamic tourism, nobody talks about either north-south. It is the blanket term called Muslim terrorism, which is used across the board, right? Even Nitish Kumar, who is apparently very proud of Bihari identity, when Biharis are attacked in Bombay or Assam, he said that no, he will fight for Bihari pride. But the same Bihari Muslim, when they are arrested from Patna, he never speaks about these Muslims being Bihari. Your only identity becomes Muslim terrorist. So my counter question to you would be, why in certain cases, you do not invoke any social cultural variable, in certain other cases we do. And I think there is something very conceptually significant going there. Now about the term, I think I'm not insistent on the usage of that particular term. So there are friends who have said that while you use Hindu Orientalism, I was Savarna Orientalism or even Brahmanical Orientalism. So these are all open for discussions. We can talk about it, which one is more effective. What I can say is that my attempt has been to identify a historical empirical phenomenon, right? We may agree or disagree about the efficacy of certain terms which might be used to narrate and to signify that phenomenon. But the more important thing is the identification of that historical empirical phenomenon or the power configuration, right? The terms can be open for discussion. Now to Professor Mujib, I mean, if your disagreement is about the degree or the intensity or the extent, okay, there is one way of looking at it. My answer, not answer, but there is no answer.
No, that I want to understand is this:
there's only a
how
response.
do you explain Narendra Modi's strategy argument about investment? What is that?
So what you see here, Modi is using Congress, okay, as a dog whistle for Muslims. So all this criticism, and even the Congress, by the way, this is very important, at the height of pandemic, when Modi issued that statement, what was the criticism that Congress said? Tughlaqi farman jari. All the negative words, okay, comes from Muslim history. Tughlaqi farman, okay, tolerance, niceness, it is always there in ancient India. Okay, so when Modi is Congress Mukt Bharat is a short word, a code word for a Muslim Mukt Bharat. Because all the on WhatsApp group, what is the story which is being narrated? That Congress is problem because Indira Gandhi has been married to Muslim. Whether it is true or not, but that is how it is right? So the Congress is identified with Muslim, right? And by the way, Congress itself, after the defeat of 2014, it set up an internal committee report assessment, and it says that this is Congress's own report that it sees that no, we have been seen as appeasing Muslims. This is
Anthony report.
That's asking Kerala, it's going to Kerala asking.
Yeah, but the point is, the Congress itself is saying this. Okay. Now, historically, if you see, I mean, once I made a chart, like you can see Congress leader moving to BJP, BJP leader moving to Congress. And this is historical, like, Gandhi had some reservation about K. Munshi, but he did admit it, although K. Munshi believed in parties, right? So it is not something which started yesterday. It is a long historical thing, and we can talk about it. So from my historical perspective, it is not, and as it is known, Congress was an umbrella organization. It had many elements. It had communist, it had socialist. Of course, it had Hindu revivalist and Hindu part too. The final point would be, so the question of leave No, I would suggest that, taking leap in itself is not necessarily, conceptually speaking, it is not a bad thing. And you were rather very parsimonious in your comment, so I think I may not have got what you actually have in your head.
We will continue the discussion.
Right, but conceptually speaking, taking leap in itself is not a negative thing, but the point is the manner in which you take the leap and for what theoretical and methodological goal, right? So my purpose here is not to deny, and the whole idea of syncretism, by the way, right? I mean, it is a common knowledge that when two tradition and two cultures interact, there will be intermingling. There is a border area between Bihar and Bengal. There are people who speak a mixture of language. There is a whole philosophy about which is called pidgin language, English and local language. But syncretism in India has a very specific name. Have you ever heard if the Tamil community moves from Madras or some other place and comes to Delhi, right? It's a different setting and different culture. Of course, we never use the term syncretism about the Tamil Hindu community moving from Madras and staying in Arkepur. Of course, there is a local intermingling. Why is it that syncretism is always used only in relation to Hindus? A Malayali community would move probably to Bengal, and then there should be cultural syncretism there, logically speaking. So syncretism in itself is not it is a right word, but why is it being reserved only to denote one particular kind of thing? In the Indian case, and even people like Ashish Nandi, is very about Delhi pogrom, he said that is from both sides. This is philosopher Ashish Nandi. But he is very great proponent of syncretism, but it is a one-sided syncretism. The manner in which Hinduism had influenced Islam, because the idea is that Islam is a religion which came from outside, it is hostile, it is intolerant, and Hinduism made it nice and moral. Okay, I have done a whole paper about this whole idea of syncretism, and that is where this whole mazar and syncretic kind of things appear. I would say just one, I see Christophe gesturing, but I will make the last sentence. I'm not gesturing. Okay. Which means I can make two sentences then, right?
Two sentences, but not one page long sentence.
So about this Islamic tourism, if you see, there's an anthropologist called Julia Eckert who has worked with police and so on. So from the colonial, when the existing bureaucracy and police and civil environment, there was a low-key survey also in which it says that every second or third police officer thinks that Muslims are prone to committing crime, right? But this is a colonial vocabulary in which Islam is always identified with violence, Hinduism is always identified with spiritualism. Sometimes the word which Orientalists used was that Hindus are timid. Okay, so that colonial kind of thing, and Julia shows that no, Hindus never, in the colonial knowledge, Hindus never initiate violence. They only respond to violence. It is always the Muslims who initiate. Okay, so that probably is one way to understand how the contemporary discourse is connected to the discourse of the past, in which, of course, Islamic terrorism is right at the center of political discourse, but nothing called the word which is used in Hindi is what is the word for intolerance? If some Hindus do, so you have to use the word intolerance, not terrorism.
Yeah,
but what happened after?
Yeah.
So do I have some time to respond? Or?
6 minutes, 40 minutes.
No, I got great questions, and can you put on the slide once again? Yeah, so excellent. I think thanks, Anjali, for reinforcing the crony capitalist stuff.
Yeah.
Because my colleague Hussain is actually working with the same vigor on crony capitalism as we are working on ethno-nationalism. And my former teacher, or teacher never becomes former, Jack Snyder, who I mentioned, actually sent me an email recently saying that, Rahul, is there anybody who has conceptualized the relationship well between ethno-nationalism and crony capitalism? And we haven't conceptualized it well enough, but I'm glad that I put it on the table and it sounded appealing to you. So that's a lot of encouragement for me. And we are, let me tell you that we are actually working. I mean, Hussain is doing work on how the regulators have got decimated. So that's one. The other is that how will competitive authoritarianism, might it get reduced? And here, I was telling Harsh yesterday that I am not an astrologer and I can give you a kind of a hypothetical answer. And my hypothetical answer is the following, and that is where I also believe that political power matters. That is that much will depend on how the politicians now, I mean, the civil society has actually done a lot of work, and I'll come to the civil society question. Now you have the situation where the BJP doesn't have a simple majority. Now the question is, how will this turn out? As you can see, Mr. Modi's strategy is very clear. He is not even pretending that he doesn't have a simple majority. People like Harsh are getting attacked to an even greater extent than they were in the past. You know, Arundhati Roy has been attacked. So you have the same home minister, you have the same speaker. So the strategy of this government is basically to go aggressively and see whether with a not even a simple majority, they can misuse the agencies that I mentioned here to intimidate both politicians in the opposition as well as in their coalition to submission. And I think the answer to this question will lie on the extent to which those people in the ruling dispensation whose interests on caste census, on Hindu-Muslim are considerably different, will they, or at what point in time, they stop getting intimidated or they feel sort of satiated with the goods that they get to bring the government down? And to what extent does the opposition maintain its cohesion and fight the propensities of the agencies, which is why I don't think this election was free and fair. So I think the answer to this question will depend to a very great extent on the political opposition. And I think what everybody here is saying is that there is a ray of hope, but it is not an answer that we can give. It could turn, and that is why the competitive authoritarian situation is a very fluid situation. So thank you for asking me that question, and we don't have much more time. Now that another great question that Claudia asked is, what is it that the BJP is giving the electorate? This is a great question. I think what the BJP, the best thing that the BJP is giving the electorate, and this is something I published in the Journal of Democracy in 2024 January, share it a year, is actually huge amounts of repression. And there is a whole literature on comparative politics that tells you that when you repress opposition politicians and civil society, it produces an enormous amount of incentive for it to come together. And I was saying that, you know, if you ask me how has opposition politics performed, my answer is that the glass is half empty and the glass is half full. The glass is half empty because the opposition could have come together more cohesively much earlier, and Mr. Modi gave them the best incentives to do that. So if you are a pessimist, you will say the glass is half empty. But if you are an optimist, you will say that, look, the conditions for the opposition to come together were very difficult. It's a very diverse country. And the fact that they could come together, and even the fact that they could fight this election under all the conditions where Congress's bank accounts were frozen, 2 chief ministers were behind bars, cabinet ministers are behind bars, and all of these things are happening under the PMLA. I didn't get the time to mention that one of the beautiful elements of the PMLA is that you don't need evidence. You can just get convicted with very little evidence, right? And this is being targeted against opposition politicians and civil society. So under those conditions, I think the best gift that Mr. Modi has given is not economic growth, is not housing, is not toilets, it's repression. And this repression, and I still believe that India is a democracy, it's not become authoritarian, has actually galvanized opposition politics and civil society in a manner which is commendable. And from there, I would argue that the strategies that the civil society organizations, and I'm really not gotten into the intricacies of what the Center for Equity Studies has done or what others have done. But I published a paper in the Journal of Democracy in January 2024, where I talked about democratic resilience. And in the democratic resilience model, I talked about the Karnataka model. And then Harsh, I, and Hussain co-authored an opinion piece and argued why it works. What we learned was that this Karnataka model is a model where opposition can actually come together under conditions of repression and fight some of the best opponents of democratic politics, which is internal factionalism, a secular narrative with a social democratic outlook, and the connection of the political parties with civil society. And we drove that model to an understanding of the state elections, and we argued that in Karnataka and Telangana, where they could do it, they won. I'm talking about the state elections. But in Chhattisgarh, Madhya Pradesh, and even in Rajasthan, where they didn't, they actually lost. So actually counterintuitive, in a country of majority Hindus, if you still take this, the kind of secularism that Christophe was talking to the ground in a coherent way, you can build bridges with social forces. And I just want to say one thing about civil society that I know about because I haven't studied it. So when I was in Karnataka, I was able to connect quite a bit with the network that produced this from the civil society side. And what was interesting there is that they were not Congress people. And I can tell you how they were not Congress people. But they had all decided that the BJP has to be beaten. And sometimes the Congress was also not even very helpful. But it is the people of India under conditions of, I mean, this kind of, Jack used to tell me that, Rahul, you've got such a great civil society, but you don't have a scholar who writes about it. And this is the tragedy of the country. So in a way, what I would argue is the question that Oyon asked, is that civil society organizations in what some people call an earthworm model, not even very evident to many opposition political parties, come together. And that same model was what this Bharat Jodo Abhiyan and whatever we talked about. And we did monitoring work. So we were also connected with civil society groups. And they would clearly say that we don't want to be recognized. We don't even want you to know who we are. But when there are electoral malpractices, we will pass on the result. So there is a very, very mature, apolitical, deeply normative, very highly committed social capital that if the political parties become more mature about, can actually use, and that is an answer to your question as well, to win elections. And the reason why I wanted you to show this slide is because, you know, Manjula, I was really delighted. I mean, I was so busy that I didn't remember. Yeah, so basically, let's go to this one. You know, what our coding suggests is that, you know, Navsarjan is here, but it is not here. Navsarjan is here because it's at the front line of fighting for Dalit rights, right? And even so, Navsarjan is an organization which lost its FCRA pretty early in the day. And Mr. Martin McMahon is somebody I really admire. But what this tells you is that if you get much more into the kind of work where you're fundamentally protecting the rights of ethnic minority Muslims, so you're doing great work, no question about that. You are far more valuable. So it's not, but then, you know, there are organizations that are not even as vulnerable as you are. So I think the beauty of your organization is that under conditions of repression, which are quite severe, like the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative, you are in that category, right? So people in our green are not in a happy space. But you have been able to innovate. I mean, because you have a social movement and that social movement serves people, people will not allow you to die, right? But then, if you have social movement types who also serve people, they can be very badly hit. As soon as you get, into that space. So I think that's the only thing that I would say. But if you disagree with this point of view, we should. But if you agree with it, then I think I'm closer to publication.
Thank you, Paul.
When do we assemble now? I think in half an hour's time.
Half an hour for lunch.
Half an hour for lunch.